We're both going to do a little bit of an introduction and talk about what we each bring to the table. My name is Deb Schmidt-Rogers, and I'm the Director of Residential Education at DePaul University. I also just began my term as Inclusion and Equity Director on the Executive Board of Akuho'ai. One of the things that Vijay and I think is really important for you to know has to do just with the webinar format. Both of us, as we've been talking and as we've seen each other present over the years, know that we really feed off of audience participation and knowing that you're with us and that you're enjoying it and that we can tell if you're not based on your facials. So because we are looking at this computer screen rather than you, we are going to assume that you are sitting in a room, nodding your heads up and down, smiling at us, maybe giving us a thumbs up so that we know you're with us and we know you're ready to move forward. Those of you who have seen me present before or seen Vijay present before know that we're not, even as I'm sitting at the computer, I'm using my hands here. So if you can just sort of picture that and nod along with me so that we know you are together.
Deb is definitely using her hands while she's talking, so I just want to testify to that. Good morning. My name is Vijay Pendakur. I'm the Director of Multicultural Student Success here at DePaul University, and I'm really excited to spend some time with you this morning and talk about supervision and social justice. Just a little bit about my office. Multicultural Student Success is probably not the most common name for a multicultural affairs office, but we're a unit that has been charged with providing retention and persistence and advocacy programming for students that are at a high risk of not having a successful DePaul experience. So these are some of our low-income students, our first-generation college students, and our students of color.
So one of the things that we think is really important when it comes to supervision is talking about what you bring to the table. Both Vijay and I all have particular personal identities that we hold. There are some, depending on the day, depending on the interaction, depending on the supervisory experience, that will impact what we do more than others. For me, I think the ones that I identify with very strongly when it comes to supervision is that of being a woman, that of being an introvert, and my staff knows this well. I would be lying if I didn't say that my role as a parent in my life also comes to the table when it has to do with supervision. So those are identities for me that are critically important. I would probably add a fourth, and that is being in an interracial marriage and raising biracial children.
For me, when I was thinking about some of what I bring to the table as a supervisor, I think definitely my gender identity as a man impacts my supervision. My identity as a person of color, and more specifically an Asian American, has bearing on my supervisory style and the way I understand supervision. Another identity that definitely has an impact on how I supervise, which I'll talk more about later, is my own experience of being second-generation American and having immigrant parents, and just seeing the importance of story and storytelling in their lives and how they make meaning of their experience coming to America. And that has definitely shown me the importance of understanding other people's stories in building meaningful relationships.
So in terms of our philosophy of supervision, we certainly could each go into great length about how we supervise, why we supervise, what we've learned over the years. But sort of when we sat down to plan this, the first sentence that kind of came out of both of our mouths was, good supervision is good supervision. You don't have, good supervision because you're supervising someone from an underrepresented population, or not good supervision because you're supervising someone from an underrepresented population. So we just want to kind of put that on the board, that we think good supervision is just that. What supervision can look like, I think, can change depending on relationships, circumstances, the position that you're in, possibly your chronological age, and whether you're supervising someone from a different generational background than you are.
So the way Deb and I thought to structure our conversation today is to try and strike a balance between those two bookends. One is the reality that there are some best practices that will transcend every supervisory relationship if you're thinking about the intersection between supervision and social justice. But on the flip side, the reality is that the best supervision occurs in individuated supervisory relationships. And so what you'll see us doing today is sort of bouncing back and forth between what you need to attend to as you build individuated relationships, and then what you always need to keep in mind for being a social justice oriented supervisor. Okay, so actually, Deb found this definition of diversity that I just loved. So thank you, Deb. It comes from the AAC and U publication in 2007. We've tried to source any theories or documents we're going to be using today so that you'll have access to this PowerPoint and you can do some follow-up on your own then. One other thing, this is a pretty wordy definition, as most definitions tend to be, but I want to call your attention to a couple of specific words in how we talk about diversity. One thing to pay attention to is the word individual. It starts right in the beginning. Our society actually really loves to talk about individual differences, and so that is part of the definition for diversity. This definition balances the identities that come from individual difference with the identities that stem from social difference, right, or group identity. And I think that's really important because it's the lived experience you have that is just about you and your uniqueness, and about the social identities you hold that sort of comprise your broader diversity identity. And so that's what we're going to be talking about when we talk about diversity and identity today. The last part of this definition, and what really clinches it for me, is the final 5 or 6 words. The differences, both individual and group, they can be engaged in the service of learning. So when we're talking about difference today, and when we're talking about diversity, I think it's really important that we clarify that we're talking about all of those differences and all those diversities that actually are part of the meaningful experience we have in institutions of learning and higher education. There are, differences between Deb and I that are very meaningful and that we need to attend to, and then one of us can blink faster than the other person, and that's a difference that we're not going to attend to. So this isn't simply giving equal weight to all differences, and that's something we wanted to make note of on the front end. That being said, what you're going to see us do in the beginning here is try and take the language of diversity, which is popular and accessible, particularly in our field of student affairs, and really nuance that with our own personal convictions around social justice. And what we mean by social justice is the challenge to take all of those identities that make up diversity and nuance them with an understanding of a couple of ideas that form the core of social justice, which are power, social construction, and intersectionality. And Deb is going to speak to social construction, and I'll speak to intersectionality. But one thing to note is that power is really what gives meaning to certain identities and makes it so that we want to attend to those identities, and it makes other identities that are not part of a social justice conversation, right? So we want to really be careful as we look at difference and understand that not all differences are equal, and that's something that we're going to unpack for you as we go over the course of this webinar.
Okay, so it's important, don't let these next 2 slides kind of overwhelm you. Once again, we wanted to make sure that we give you all the citations so that if you choose to come back to the webinar later, you can look up these articles, you can perhaps read them, unpack them. They would make great readings for your staffs and staff discussion and professional development. So as someone who has been in the field for a long period of time, I often get the question, well, how do you translate theory into practice? And, for new professionals that are just coming out of grad school and have that experience of, they spent a lot of time in grad school doing that, often I think there's a thought that when a student comes into your office or when a situation arises, that you have a moment of clarity where you're thinking, oh, I'm going to look at this situation through X frame, or this student must be in, Z vector, or this student must be in Y vector. And as you move through your chronological positions and gain a breadth of experience, you will find that that becomes almost natural, and you're not conscious of the fact that you're doing it, but you are nonetheless doing it. So it's important to understand theory, not because you're going to stop and think before every interaction, but because practice and the practical are always shaped by theory, and it kind of provides you with a framework and a frame of reference outside of your own. Having said that, there are 6 sort of different theories on the next 2 slides. I am not going to talk about all of them, but we wanted all of them on the slide so that you do have an opportunity to review them. Most of you are probably familiar with Cross's theory of psychological migressence, and it really is, it sort of refers to the process of, and I'm putting quotes up here with my fingers, turning black. And it's a very time-tested theory, and it starts out with sort of that pre-encounter where students really have a pretty low saliency when it comes to racial understanding, and it ends with internalization where students or people really have a really healthy identity that involves both a reference group identity and their own notion of race saliency. So that's an important theory, I think, to understand when it comes to particularly African American Black students on your campus in terms of how they might be moving through their identity. In terms of white identity theory and development, it really isn't so much about my development, for example, as a white person alone. Really, white identity development began as a way to explain how white people come to terms with their whiteness relative to, with respect to race and race privilege. I think sometimes this is confusing, particularly for some of our white male students, to understand that the theory and the identity development is really based upon, again, respect to race and privilege. And again, there are some, I don't want to call them necessarily steps as if you have to move through them in a linear fashion, but there are certainly very different stages of having no sort of social consciousness of race, being pretty naive when it comes to an understanding or a recognition of another culture, and then kind of moving all the way through so that you have internalized and you not only are aware of racial consciousness and where you fit, but you are integrating that into all aspects of your life.
I just wanted to hop in here and sort of connect back to something that was said earlier about the importance of understanding and tracking power in how we work with students, grads, entry-level staff, mid-level staff. Both Cross's psychosocial migressence and most major white identity theories have a place on the spectrum where the person you're analyzing has very low levels of racial salience. What it means for a black student or any student of color to have low racial salience versus what it means for a white person to have low racial salience are 2 very different things. For a white person to have low racial salience actually helps them use their white privilege more effectively. For a person of color to have low racial salience does not actually position them to receive any special privileges. And so that's where you have to take the diversity conversation and make sure that you're injecting a social justice lens into how you understand these different theories.
Thanks, Vijay. All right, I'm not necessarily going to talk about social justice model. Vijay's going to talk about that in a little more depth on a future slide. Talking about critical race theory, and there's not a singular critical race theory, but critical race theories in general really talk about how what we believe, and we being me looking at myself in a mirror as kind of from a dominant culture, sort of how race-neutral laws and institutional policies can really help sort of perpetuate racial subordination, and really trying to have an understanding of how important that is, particularly in the academy, when there are so many ways that we institutionalize things that we are not even aware of doing, whether it's from admission to financial aid to the sort of area of multicultural student affairs, which on most campuses is simply a programming, body, and sort of more social than perhaps it is here at DePaul, where it really has a focus on retention and student success. So, it really talks about how racism is endemic in American life. It talks about challenging history and really helps us and wants us to focus on context and really looking at the contextual analysis of any institutional policies that we have. It's very interdisciplinary. It really, critical race theory talks about that you cannot sort of my words, you can't compartmentalize. You can't just look at something in and of itself without understanding the context and the layers and the blending of all the factors and all the influences. And it really, you know, in the end, works to end racial oppression simply as a part and parcel of a broader goal of ending all oppression.
Okay, so I know that we've been, you know, spending some time in high theory here, and Deb and I are committed to bringing this session around to talk about experiences we've had in the workplace as supervisors and making this real and meaningful for you. We just wanted to find a way to take these identity theories and you know, modes of analysis like critical race theory and bring them into practice. And so one more recent study and publication that I thought if you had time to read something you know, this week that you could take a look at that blends a lot of the gains from the canonical research in the field is some of the work by Aves, Jones, and McEwen on the relationship between social construction, intersectionality, and meaning making. And so Deb, if you wouldn't mind actually advancing the slide, I think the best way to unpack this is through this nifty diagram that comes from the article referenced on the previous slide. In the upper right corner, you can see this swirling set of lines with dots on it, right? And you have to imagine that as the person you're supervising, whether that be a student, coordinator, an RD, a grad, and that's someone's identity, right? And there's all of these different vectors, and all of those intersections represent the fact that we are not just our race or our gender or our sexual orientation, but we are the added complexity of the intersections of all those identities. And if you notice in this diagram, you can't pick this apart very easily. It's not a square or a cube. These are, you cannot extricate any one of these identities from the others, and that's really important. That's an important part of the diagram. The dots on the diagram are those socially constructed identities that are vested with power: race, class, gender, sexual orientation, ability, faith. We could go on with the list, but these are the identities that are heavily written about in the literature. So what the article challenges us to do is to understand that a person's identity is not a linear, there's not a linear relationship between a person's identity and how they make meaning of their experiences. There's a meaning-making filter that actually constantly helps them or hinders them from interpreting their experiences in ways that allows them to be successful in the world. And so the meaning-making filter is something that Deb and I are going to come back to. When you're building supervisory relationships, you can't just think about, and I know all of us want to be socially just supervisors, right? So you're going to be tracking the identities that your staff hold, but there's a extra filter between their identities and how they think about the world, and that's the meaning-making filter. And this meaning-making filter is totally layered with contextual experiences, and this is where that CRT, the critical race theory, comes back in. Family norms, childhood experiences, stereotypes that we've been bombarded with, gender-based messaging on bulletin boards and buses and trains, socio-political conditions of the moment, right? Are we at war in 3, Muslim nations, right? Whatever's going on in the world has a huge bearing on how someone takes their identities and then makes a lens through which they create stories every day. And part of what being a socially just supervisor is doing is you have to develop the ability to understand how your staff are thinking as a result of their identities and their meaning-making filter. And that's what we're going to really be talking about for the second half of this webinar.
So, what do we mean when we say additive properties do not work in supervision? So let's just play this out. So you are supervising an individual who is a man, who is African American, and who identifies as gay. Now, that does not mean that those 3 properties, you know a lot about men, you know a lot about African Americans, and you know a lot about gay culture. So, ergo, you know a lot about supervising this individual. No. Those additive properties do not work in supervision. And that is simply because of what Vijay was talking about with the meaning-making filter that's in the middle. So, for example, a way that we sometimes talk about black men is that they are strong, that they are masculine, that they carry themselves in a certain way. When you layer that with being a gay man, that is often a identity that in the African American community is a difficult identity to accept, to be out in that community. If you were not to think of those, but anyway, as in the additive properties, you might think that you know how to supervise that particular individual. So I use that example to say that simply having knowledge of X, Y, and Z identity does not mean that you can adequately or justly supervise someone who has those X, Y, and Z identities.
Another thing we want to call your attention to as we put out our cautionary, road flares on this journey is the notion of visible and invisible diversity, or visible and invisible identities. Most of us do not supervise isolated individuals, right? We supervise groups of individuals, and when we are building supervisory relationships, one of the things Deb and I will come back to over and over again is how we understand these identities. To go back to Deb's example, blackness, masculinity, and identifying as gay. There's the knowledge of those communities, but there's also the idea that some of these identities are visible and have a direct bearing on someone's experience because they cannot hide those identities. And other identities, like being gay, are invisible identities. And so that provides new supervisory challenges because someone might disclose to you an invisible identity that they don't want the group to know about. And that's something that you have to be able to keep track of as you build a cohesive team as a leader and a supervisor. The other thing is visible and invisible diversity puts added pressure on group members that have visible diversity to represent those groups. And something you need to do as a supervisor is manage those group processes so that folks who have certain visible diversities, if you have a group of student leaders that you supervise or professional staff, and if there's only one identifiable woman on your team, you want to make sure that that person is not put in the place of speaking for womanhood or womankind every time gender-based issues come up on staff. And so, as we think about identity, the intersectionality issue provides some level of complexity, and the visible and invisible diversity also adds layers to this process.
At this point, we want to just take a pause. Our next sort of sets of slides will talk about some supervisory and supervision best practices and connect them back to sort of this context of social justice and supervision. But before we move into those, we wanted to stop and see whether there are right now any questions. And I think you can type those into the chat function on your computer. I'm not sure whether anyone is mic'd up. If so, if Eric wants to, take some raised hands, that's okay. But we are open to any questions that anyone might have at this point. And we'll just
right now, Deb, we
here
don't have any questions in the queue. If anybody does have any questions, feel free to enter those now, and we can address those with the group. Or if you have your audio connected and a microphone, or you're dialed in on the phone, and you would like to ask a question verbally, you can press the raise your hand button, and we might be able to call on you and do that. Deb just wanted to share some great feedback from Wesleyan. The staff down there says they're loving it. Many smiles and thumbs up around the conference table. So not necessarily a question, but there's that feedback you were looking for.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
That's nice to hear.
That made us smile. We can certainly move on. If people don't have questions, that's great. I guess that means we must be crystal clear.
We're gonna definitely have time for questions at the end too, and I think that the second section might help elicit more questions or at least comments, because what we're going to be doing is getting more tangible at this point and trying to put some of that theory into practice for ourselves in the session. So supervision best practices. So what are you actually supposed to do? We've given you all the cautionary tales at this point. One of the first things Deb and I thought about when we were thinking about best practices is there's this rule, right? Know yourself, be yourself. I think there's some anxiety around supervision, particularly when you first start supervising. student staff, and then the anxiety increases when you're supervising pro staff or GAs. But one of the things is you cannot change your life story and your experiences and the identities that result from that. And so one of the first things you need to do is get in touch with your identity so you can figure out not only the marginalized identities you hold, which you probably have figured out by the time you're supervising, but the privileges you hold. All of us hold certain privileges that we need to get in touch with if we're going to be effective social justice supervisors. On top of that, the flip side of knowing yourself is the ability to just be yourself, right? And when we were thinking about how to describe being yourself, we thought about two words: humility and authenticity. At least in my experience, there are no years that have gone by that I haven't made mistakes as a supervisor, and the humility that comes into understanding that part of being myself as a supervisor is understanding that there's no mastering this. It's a journey and not a destination. And so having the humility to understand that you're going to make mistakes and being able to apologize for those mistakes and trusting in the process that hopefully if you were authentic in building good supervisory relationships, that your team can weather the fact that you're not a master of supervision, that you are a supervisor and a human being. And that's where authenticity is really important. Being transparent with the identities you hold and the struggles that you face at the same time that you acknowledge that this is a work in process. And finally, acknowledging that as much diversity as there is on a team, as you explore people's stories and share your own story, you're going to find shared experiences. Even when you think there might not be any, when you take over a new staff, let's say, that you didn't hire, right, you're going to find shared experiences. And those shared experiences are so important in building relationships that can help you weather the storm of the learning process that social justice supervision is. So that's some of the ways we wanted to break down knowing yourself and being yourself.
Thanks, Vijay. This is kind of a broad slide. So developing quality characteristics. And, you know, I identified these 6 characteristics as sort of key to, you know, we started out by saying good supervision is good supervision. And we believe that these 6 characteristics are key to good supervision. But let's talk about them in the context of good supervision and inclusion and equity and diversity. Communication, obviously very key. Most of the feedback that I have had over my years as a supervisor, and it cycles through, and I'll bet Vijay could say the exact same thing. So as you're cycling through, your staff either feels that communication within the team is stupendous or it sucks, excuse me. And there's sort of no middle of the road. And I think that you'll find, for those of you who may have supervised for a while, if you look back, it cycles through with different staff groups. So being able to pay attention to your own communication style, know which and what of your baggage comes with that, and being able then to communicate, and communication for me means sort of a transparency, making sure that when you talk with staff, you are transparent about what you are communicating in terms of the same thing to everyone, so no one feels like they got something that someone else didn't get, and oh, they must have gotten it because they were X, Y, and Z, or because Deb is X, Y, and Z. So it's really important to develop for yourself what that important communication piece is for you. Loyalty is a very interesting word, I think, in 2011. With the sort of downturn in the economy, I often feel that I hear conversations where people say they are feeling less loyal to I'll use DePaul because that's where I am, you know, feeling less loyal to DePaul because certainly in an economic downturn, DePaul's not going to be loyal to me. That's kind of what I would be hearing. I personally, yeah, I'm one of those people who usually puts it out there. I take offense to that. I feel like my job as a supervisor is to be extremely loyal to my institution and to be loyal to who I am, that know yourself and be yourself. I can't be loyal to something that I'm not. I can't try to pretend that there's something that I'm not. So loyal to who you are, loyal to your institution and what it stands for, and loyal to the employees that you are responsible for getting to the next level. If you don't engage in trying to develop all of the employees with all of their layers and all of their individual differences, you're not going to be a successful supervisor. Fairness. Fairness is one of those words, you know, what one person considers fair, someone else considers unfair. So it's important, I think, that you communicate to your staff what you mean when you say fairness. Is fairness consistency? And we'll talk about this on another slide. Is fairness equality? Is fairness being equitable with all your staff? Collectively, as a supervisory team, you and the team that you supervise need to define what it means to be fair to one another within that group. And that will definitely be lensed, you know, depending on where you come from and the experiences. As a parent, I often feel like I need to make sure if one child is getting 17 presents for Christmas, okay, I'm exaggerating. If one child is getting 2 presents for Christmas, the other child needs to get 2 presents for Christmas. If I spent $200 on one child, I have to spend $200 on the other child. And that blends over into the way that I supervise staff. I'm very conscious of the amount of time that I spend with people, how that might be perceived, whether or not there are any differences or diversity components to how that is being perceived. Perception equals reality often in the workplace, and that's something you have to think of. Positive attitude for me is probably the #1 quality characteristic that one needs to be a good supervisor. Positive intentionality is sort of my mantra. Everyone wants you to have all of the information that you need to do your job, and why would someone intentionally keep the information from you that you need to do your job? I think often where that gets stuck is when people assume things based on the differences that we've been talking about and assume that maybe you are not or you are as a result of. So again, that communication is critical. The ability to delegate, the ability to know to whom to delegate, which means you need to know all of the qualities of the people that you supervise so that you can understand how to delegate that well. And then finally, if you don't want to do the job, if you are not for the students and about student success, then don't be in this field. Okay, that's pretty blunt, sorry, but that's just kind of how I feel. In terms of accountability, another, when we were thinking about supervision in the context of diversity, accountability is where we think a lot of folks as supervisors get stuck. We often seem more willing or less willing to hold individuals accountable based on who we think they are and what we think they can do and what we think their story is. So it's important to understand that equal does not mean equitable. If you're supervising someone and you're talking to them about their life experience, they will certainly resonate with this. And we could, we could spend hours just on this one topic when we're talking about, equal education and we're talking about equal opportunity. Again, my hands up in quotes. And what does it mean to be equitable with your staff and allow everyone to have opportunities? All those opportunities may not look identical. So equal does not mean equitable. Consistency does not mean the same. And I'm going to sort of couch that under the shared expectations. Both the equal and equitable and the consistency and not the same will be very easily discussed if you as a supervisor are doing a good job of sharing expectations and that those expectations are shared in mutuality. So, not just you saying, here are my expectations of you as staff. And, often we all do that on day 1 or day 2, and then we say to the staff, so what expectations do you have of me? Well, they don't know you. They don't know your experiences. They don't know the differences that go along with those experiences, and they don't understand what those have to do with sharing expectations. So it's important to revisit those often after you as a team have identified what those differences are in your team that are important and need to be brought to the surface in the context of diversity and difference. So it's important to share expectations, revisit those often, so that when you are supervising people and they think that you are supervising non-equally or inconsistently, they will understand that consistency does not always mean the same and that equal does not mean equitable.
Just want to say that after hearing that Christmas at Deb's house involves 17 presents and $200, I know where I'm going to be spending my Christmas this December. So final supervision best practices, and I will definitely continue to try and contextualize this in the social justice and inclusion paradigm that we're working in here, because all of these are actually supervisory best practices in general. The issue of boundary setting, and I think this is something that for me is always challenging, and I mean that in the sense that from the minute I started supervising student staff, I had a great supervisor that talked to me about boundary setting and the difference between being friendly to versus friends with. But my supervisory style is very relational, and I would say Deb's supervisory style is very relational as well. I think a lot of folks who do social justice work build relationships and supervise best through relationships. Earlier when we were talking about our identities that we hold, and Deb was sharing that she has an identity as a parent, and I was sharing that my identity as a second-generation American has an impact on my supervision. This is where this comes to bear. I really deeply believe in understanding people's stories and how those stories have gotten them to where they are and how I can support them better on their journey as a result of knowing that story. But when you put the time into elicit story, it can murky and blur the lines that usually set up supervision in a very sort of cold or corporate context, right? So when you know someone's story and you have a heart for justice, all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, they've had such a difficult time and they didn't learn this skill that they need now because of whatever they experienced in the past, and all of a sudden you can find yourself being friends with and giving accommodations that are not equitable on your team. And so part of my own journey has been learning how to balance my investment with story with also understanding that I'm not helping anyone if I blur the lines to the point where I allow for inequitable practices on my team. And so some of that is captured by being friendly to versus friends with, but I really think the boundary setting has to be really nuanced, right? As a social justice supervisor, you can't simply say, well, I'm not going to know anything about you and we're going to get the work done and go home, because you will walk all over the justice issues in the room then, right? You're not going to be able to manage shared or differential identities, which is the second bullet on this slide, if you don't elicit story and engage story. But on the flip side, setting a boundary of professional conduct and setting a boundary of consistency and equity will allow you to do a better job of managing relational supervision with social justice. And part of that is going to be managing those shared identities. Deb and I thought it was important to make a sort of special note of this. Any team you supervise, you're going to find that you share identities with certain members of your team and not with other members of your team. Whatever those identities are, you're going to have saliency and you're going to have story overlap with someone on your team. And as much as you think you might be the only person noticing this, trust the process that everyone will notice this. And that's part of where perception defines reality catches up with you unless you are vigilant about recognizing that you don't have to squash shared identities, right? I mean, if you were the first in your family to go to college and only one other member of your team was a first-generation college student, you don't have to pretend that didn't happen. But at the same time that you recognize that and invest in that identity, being clear and transparent with the fact that that's not going to change the way you apply your best practices consistently across your team. And that's something that I think it's important to do from the beginning of building supervisory relationships.
I think what can really help with that is when you go back to what Vijay said maybe 4 slides ago of shared experiences. The shared identities are really easy for us to gravitate towards, but sometimes as a supervisor it is your role to assist the team in finding those shared experiences so that they can all blend their identities and use them for the positive in terms of that shared experience, whether it's serving students, serving the institution, serving the committee, etc.
Yeah, I was just thinking that sometimes I think when I sit with all of, even what Deb and I have just put out in this webinar, let alone, you know, the 100 points that didn't make it into our PowerPoint, it can be quite overwhelming, and particularly in the face of if you're lucky enough to supervise truly diverse teams, where you've just got countless myriad of identities and social experiences on your team. Part of a strategy that you can use when you face that level of complexity is to invest the time and energy to build new shared experiences. And that's something that I just didn't think about as a supervisor for my first couple supervisor positions, but I invest a lot in now. As a director of a department, I don't only have to rely on where we've been to build some glue on the team that can get us through the hard times. We can actually go out and do some things together that'll allow us to have new shared experiences, whether that is going and seeing a play together and talking about it afterwards, particularly if it's a particularly loaded topic, in the play that can really help bring some ideas to the table that can help us understand each other better, or going and doing service together. DePaul offers this really cool program where staff and student affairs can serve breakfast at the soup kitchen attached to the St. Vincent de Paul Parish, which is right next to our student center. And all of the staff that have gone and done that have come back and talked about how they've been able to relate with coworkers differently in the act of service. And that also provides a glue that you can leverage as a supervisor to get your team through tough times. And so that's a different way of thinking about shared experience as not only something in the past, but something you can create for the future.
One other note that I just was thinking about that I'm not sure Vijay and I have talked about is oftentimes as a supervisor, I think we find it more difficult to be the one in a vulnerable position. We often want to be there for our staff when they have vulnerabilities that they want to show us. And we don't understand that showing vulnerability is not a sign of weakness. And showing vulnerability does not mean that you're crossing the friendly versus friends with. Showing vulnerability is simply another way to share experiences and another way for the people that supervise you to understand your complexity and your complex identities. I have, I think, taken a little bit longer to learn that than perhaps some have, but I am more recently trying to embrace the sort of sharing of those vulnerabilities that we all have, that we bring with us to the table when we supervise. All right, we are at that opportunity where both Vijay and I are going to just sort of share some overall overarching thoughts. And I think for me, when I think about inclusion and supervision from a social justice perspective, I think most often about the slide that started out, know yourself and know your story. If you are not in touch with yourself, your story, and really importantly, your privilege, and don't think for a second that because you may come from an underrepresented group that there's no privilege involved. We are all in higher education. We have all had the privilege. If you're sitting in this room listening to this webinar, chances are your privilege has included a college education. It more than likely could have included graduate work, which is a huge privilege in our world. So know yourself, know your story, understand your privilege that comes with it. Second layer to that is to know your staff and to know their story and to try as best you can to understand their privilege. Often sharing our privileges is something that we feel uncomfortable with. It's uncomfortable for me to say that I am, privileged as a white, heterosexual Christian woman. I mean, that's got like so many loaded privileges. It embarrasses me to say it. I mean, it really does. But I think it's important that you, in addition to knowing yourself and your privileges, that you know the stories of your staff and understand their privileges. Try to explore the invisible diversities of your staff. I think if you didn't know me well, you might not know just looking at me that I am raising biracial children. You might not know that I am an adoptive mom. You might not know that I, and becoming a caregiver to a parent. And all of those things are really important to the understanding of how I do my work and how I supervise. So it's important to, without crossing that friendly friend with, to explore the invisible diversities of your staff. Be open to multiple perspectives, be honest, be transparent, and when you receive feedback, be honest about your response. I tell the staff with whom I have the privilege to work all the time that when you go to give someone feedback or you go to have a conversation, it's important for that person to understand why you're having a conversation and what it is you expect to come from that conversation, so that they in turn can say, okay, yes, that's great, I can do it. No, Deb, not so much. I'm not going to be able to do that for you, or I need some time to think about it. And I think often as supervisors, when we give feedback, we spew, and we don't always say, and this is what I am looking for as a result. And can you do this for me, or can't you do this for me, or what can we do to make this feel better for both of us? So it's important to have to be open to those multiple perspectives, to be honest with yourself and the persons that you are responsible for supervising, and to be transparent.
Deb, that was a really nice summary of a lot of the best practices we touched on. You know, I was thinking about supervision over time in this career, and I think both Deb and I have had the opportunity over time to supervise student leaders, to supervise GAs, and then supervise coordinator level staff, supervise assistant directors. And as directors of a department, I was trying to think about what I would share for those of you who are listening who are maybe further along in your journey. And one of the things that I think about frequently is the social justice commitment to community, and that we don't have to do this alone. I think that leadership is a very isolating process if you use a dominant framework for doing leadership work. Well, it's on you. You got to do it by yourself and never show fear, right? And that is, in terms of social justice, that is a train wreck in the making. One of the best things that I can do for myself as a socially just supervisor is build a strong community of other justice-minded advocates who I can pick up the phone and call and say, okay, I've got a supervision dilemma. I do this with Deb, I do this with Art Munin, I do this with my sister, Sumi Pendakur, other people who are in the field who I can say, what do I do with this hiring decision I'm facing? Or, you know, I've got a conduct issue. I've got an employee conduct issue that I'm looking at here. You know, help me out here, because I can't figure this all out by myself. And having sounding boards or having wiser people in my life really helps me grow as a supervisor, make better decisions, and understand that justice is not lived in individual experiences. Justice is lived in community. I think we do that really well as entry-level staff. We're constantly checking in with each other, and somewhere along the way, it's easy to lose sight of that. And so I would urge all of you who are in entry and mid-level roles to continue growing your community and being vulnerable with that community. And for those of you who are running departments or even whole areas of universities, to reinvest in building a community that helps you be a social justice supervisor.
Excellent. At that point, we are done with our formal remarks. We have listed our contact information on the slide here, both our emails as well as our Twitter names, because both of us do like to tweet and feel like that has been a community that for both of us, you know, has been really informative, as well as, you know, speaking of that justice is lived in community that Vijay just had, there's a whole different community out there. We are open for any questions that people might have, any comments, any follow-ups you'd like to see. This would be a great time to let Glakuho and let Tim know, let Anne-Marie know, you know, oh, this is great. Now, this would be a terrific follow-up webinar to this, and I'm sure they can find someone out there who'd be thrilled to host that webinar for them.
Okay, Deb, we have a couple questions that came in and some feedback that folks wanted to share. Karishma said, Deb, I like what you said about showing vulnerability to our employees or students. We often mix being open with being authentic. It's an interesting balance I often find difficult. And she also said that justice lives in community. Rob in Michigan shared, so true, Vijay, the higher up you go, the fewer peers on your campus. We do have a question, though. Zena asks, can you talk about how to manage supervisees who do not reveal invisible diversity?
That's a great question, Zena. Can we talk about that later when you walk over from that office that's 10 feet away? No.
Thanks for the singer.
Yeah. You know, I suspect, no, I am confident that there are identities that I hold that I have not shared with people. And I am certain, sitting in my office looking at Vijay, that there are a myriad of identities that he holds that I may never know. And I think at that point, you need to go back to all of the things that we said about social justice and what social justice is. You know, all you can do is your best. All you can do is do it in community. All you can do is do it in an open, transparent, honest environment. And I think if you model the sharing of your identities, the staff that you supervise may be more likely to share those identities that they feel are important as their role to a supervisor. Now, there are also identities I have that probably have absolutely nothing to do with the way that I supervise. That's probably not really true, but it sounded good at the time that it first came out of my mouth. All my identities have to do with how I supervise. So I think there's only, you know, all you can do is provide the open community for people to share. You know, you can't force that.
Yeah, I think about the relationship between vulnerability and social justice, and one of the things that I've seen happen in the workplace that I would urge you to not do is to use vulnerability as some sort of leverage. There's a really sort of twisted interpretation of vulnerability where you share strategically to try and get someone to share back with you, right? I'll show you mine if you show me yours. It's a really crude analogy for that, but that's not what we're talking about when we talk about vulnerability. I love what Deb said. All you can do is create the space, because the whole goal of social justice is to change the context so that oppression becomes a smaller and smaller reality within our locus of control. And so if you keep your eye on the prize of social justice, the vulnerability that you bring into the room, what you share, will be because you think it's the right thing to do, not because you're using that vulnerability to leverage sharing from other people. And Zena, I appreciate your question, because sometimes as supervisors we actually know something about a staff member that we wish they would bring into the room, because how it would change the dynamic on a team, or how useful it would be for an educational process. And ultimately, as we think about what is just for each individual in a group, sometimes someone might not be ready, or it's just they feel that it's nobody else's business. And so we have to find a way to reach the educational outcomes we desire for a group without leveraging identities in the group sometimes. And that's challenging, but it's a reality on every team I've ever supervised.
That's it for the questions I have queued up. If anybody has any other questions, feel free to submit them now. We'll go ahead and make this the last call for questions.
Vijay and I certainly want to thank you all for being a terrific audience, because we know you were nodding right along with us. A few of you, I just had an opportunity while Vijay was talking to check Twitter, because I noticed that a few people had commented, so we certainly appreciate those comments. They reinforce that talking with our hands and nodding with each other was helpful to us while we were sitting in the room. We hope that you have found this helpful, and certainly either of us would be happy to engage in additional follow-up, and you can get in touch with us in those multiple ways.
Yeah, thank you for being generous with your time today, and I look forward to meeting many of you in real life in the future.
Okay, we did have 2 questions come in, so we'll make this, actually 1 question come in. This will be the last question of the presentation today. What activities or strategies might one use in training or team building for sharing social justice issues in individual experience?
Nice question. That's a great tangible crossover from all of the philosophy and theory and best practice we've been talking about. I think that this is actually an area that our field has done quite a good job in. There are enormous resources out there for bringing activities and processes into your staff trainings that allow people to bring their social justice selves to work, right? All of this would fall under sort of the bigger umbrella of diversity education or social justice education within the field of student affairs. And so everything from your basic crossing the line experiences that allow people in a challenge by choice setting to take a stand on different issues and to establish a level of diversity understanding in the room, which are very basic exercises that many of us have been through. Those exercises still stay useful into the future, right? Each new team you are able to supervise will benefit from those exercises. I think about exercises that are more case study based. And Deb uses case studies in her supervisory work, so I'll turn it over to Deb.
I just purchased a book at Akuho. Actually, as soon as Vijay was done, I was going to reference this book. It's called Unleashing Suppressed Voices on College Campuses, Diversity Issues in Higher Education. It's by Brown Hinton and Howard Hamilton. And it is a book that is devoted to case studies in a variety of categories. Two that might be really good for folks within housing. There are 8 case studies on emerging diversity populations, and there are 7 on student affairs and external relations. And it's an excellent book and really talks through the case studies and gives you multiple perspectives from which to view the case, and would be, I think, really excellent in conversation with staff.
You know, one of the really neat things about supervising a case study analysis is that this actually provides you a nice chance to be vulnerable with your staff, because you can take the role of facilitator and not expert, right? And so when you have your staff read a case study and discuss it together, you're all in the learning process together. And that's one of those nice bounded moments in which you're part of the learning team and you're not having to hold that supervisory role. And there you can say, you know, this is where I got stuck. I didn't know what to do at this point in the case study. And so that can provide you some vulnerable opportunities there. I think also one of the things in thinking about diversity and justice work that I've been able to do as a director working with professional staff is, and my sister gave me this idea, is do book clubs occasionally with my professional staff. And so when a new seminal text comes out in the field, I've bought copies for everybody on staff and structured a book club. We did Eduardo Bonilla Silva's Racism Without Racists a little while ago to look at new paradigms for understanding racism and understanding the language our students were using. This summer, for a very summer book club experience, a couple of my staff and I are reading the new biography of Malcolm X that Manning Marable published after 20 years of work. Now, that might not be directly relevant to our work, but it provides us the opportunity to engage in the broader conversation about justice, our society, contextual issues, how we feel about these issues, and that allows us to build that social justice capital on staff in a very different way.
Okay, thank you so much. That was a great question, great answers, and this has just been an overall excellent webinar. Thank you so much for your time in presenting. Just as a quick reminder to everybody, the recording of today's webinar will be posted on the website under the resources heading. Before we wrap up, though, I would like to introduce Anne-Marie Klotz, Lukuho President, who needs to make a few quick announcements.
Thanks, Eric, and thanks to everyone for being on this call today. We estimated that there are about 150 people who actually listened in to the webinar, so thank you so much for your participation. Another quick note is that we will be sending an evaluation out to you shortly for everyone who registered. Please take some time to fill that out. We really appreciate your thoughts and often ask what future ideas you may have for webinar topics. Finally, we are very excited to announce that next week registration will go live for Lukuho 2011. We hope to see many of you in Grand Rapids for the celebration of our 40th conference. You'll be seeing emails about registration information going out shortly, but just wanted to get you excited for that opportunity. Thanks again, and we hope to see you at our next webinar.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.